I got involved in the martial arts just at the end of elementary school. It was one of those things where I just did not quite fit into team sports, and I grew up in the rough and tumble areas of Philadelphia, and fighting was kind of common, so my parents got me into karate, and it just really spurred this huge interest in Japanese culture, which I just kept following and doing my own studies in Japanese language until I could actually get there. Of course, as soon as you dive into a culture like that, though, one side of your family is going to rebel a little bit. So my mother was quite interested in keeping me a Europhile and wanted me to fence and continue that side of my cultural experience. But I got to Japan eventually. My university had a campus over there, so I transferred to Temple University there. And they happened to be right around the corner from the Yoshinkan Hombu Dojo. And that was my introduction to Aikido. And I trained there for a year and then 2 more years back in Philadelphia in the Yoshinkan before I moved back to Japan in '91 after graduating university. And I happened upon an Aikido dojo, as you know, as so many things are serendipitous in my life, that was right around the corner, basically between my subway stop and my apartment. And I heard that telltale sound of bodies hitting the floor. So I opened the door, and that dojo was probably the dojo that changed my life, because it was a small little hole in the wall dojo, no more than 14, 15 mats. And, but it had 3 6-dans in Aikido, and plus 4 different Koryu you could study. And that dojo's requirement was you must study a Koryu to train Aikido there. And I wound up doing Yagyu Shinkage Ryu. That was the path I chose. But my main instructor there also trained in multiple other arts. And since I would always get to the dojo early on Saturdays, I got kind of indoctrinated. Then one of the other instructors who taught Tenden Ryu, maybe he felt a little bit jealous and decided he wanted to teach me too. So he taught me some Tenden Ryu, and I had nothing better to do in my early 20s. So I trained all the time. I just trained all the time. And yeah, that was my introduction to it.
Well, beautiful. So you're the 18th headmaster of the Edo Yagyu Shinkage Ryu. That's not so common for foreigners. Maybe you can say a word or two about that before we go into our topic. I think it's relevant.
Sure. I had never heard of it until I met Toby. I had never heard of a foreign headmaster of any of the Japanese arts. And then after meeting Toby and delving a bit deeper into it, I found a couple others. But even after Sono Sensei passed, we didn't think it was going to go that way. We were prepared to stick with the traditional Japanese model and take somebody who had a blood kind of relation, not to the Yagyu family, because we separated from that a while ago, but to our lineage. And I started training him, but it just didn't work out. And the last of us around in the group in Japan just decided that, I should take over. And
so I guess it was a relative or the son, I believe, or a grandson.
Yes, the grandson of the 16th headmaster was going to take over.
Okay, so there was the bloodline, but not necessarily the Shu-Ha line. They didn't have there wasn't the proficiency line.
Correct, and there's of course politics. Get 3 people in a room, there's politics, but there was just little kind of problems with how he kind of viewed the last headmaster, because he didn't train with him. He trained with his grandfather. And we just put the kibosh on it and told him, this is the view. This is how you have to go with it. It's not just about your family.
Well, great. So why don't you just do a little bit of an overview? We have lots of time to go deep into what Shu-Ha-Ri is, but maybe you can give a bit of an overview of what it means to you from your own development and also with Shu-Ha.
Sure. I guess the first time I heard of Shu-Ha-Ri was learning a little bit about tea ceremony. And when you first start, practicing tea, and I have no ranking in tea or no real experience in tea other than experiencing it. But I frequently ask a lot of questions like foreign students in Japan do, and luckily they don't mind talking about it. But it kind of was just expressed to me as, don't worry about this yet. You'll get up to it. And the karate I had studied have never taught much of it, but my kendo instructor also talked about it quite a bit. He would always say, don't worry about it yet. You'll get there. It's part of the process. And once I got in Japan and started training Aikido more seriously, of course, my Aikido instructors at the time were more of the, what I call the old guard. You know, they were direct students of O Sensei, and that was still more of that, I'll call it a Koryu flavor to the training, right? It was the old system where you train kata, you learn directly from the teacher, and you had to feel them do it. You know, it wasn't just, also not just them do it, but you had to feel, you had to receive their attack and do it so that you could experience it properly. And when I brought it up with my instructors, they would talk about it, but they would always, everybody had a different way of explaining it, and which I always thought was pretty interesting because it's such a complex field for 3 words to describe, you know. And the beauty of the Japanese language is having those be characters and not really words. You can interpret it 5 or 6 different ways.
There's a lot of room for interpretation.
Right. So the one I always went for with Shu was to preserve, because in the Koryu, we're all about preservation. You know, I'd love to say it's about making it work, but in reality, it's about keeping it alive. We want to preserve as much as we can. And then, you know, kind of the second one, sometimes I think of as destroy, the ha, but destroy maybe is not my favorite. It's so complicated. Mm-hmm. Is that it's more like dig into it, rip it apart, pull it apart until you find out all the pieces. And then Ri would be more of the experience it, and in that sense, a divine sense, right? Not you doing it, but it happening.
Awesome. So, okay, so let me just say a couple of words about Shu-Ha-Ri too, and then we can kind of go into a dialogue, because you know, I've already said something in the previous call, so I don't want to repeat myself. But I love that you mentioned the first one, you know, the Japanese character Shu is Mamoru, is preserved or protected, can also be translated there. And my own Aikido teacher, Morihiro Saito Sensei, Morihiro is his first name. It's two kanji characters, and the first one is Mori. Mori is Mamoru, it's the preserved. But it was not his original name. His name was Morihiro, but the kanji was O Sensei changed the kanji, because O Sensei appointed Saito Sensei as the protector of the Aikido shrine. He was his attendant for all those years in Iwama. So he actually he changed the character of his name for Mamoru, and he was very, very, very strict in teaching the preservation, even though it wasn't a Koryu. It was, you know, the Iwama Aikido that he was teaching, he was very much about the preservation of the form, preservation of what he had learned, and he was side by side with us for 23 years, and he had an amazing Shu system, and it was a very solid foundation for which to build upon. And he was also really amazing about teaching Ha, and Ha for me is a little bit different than I think other people will relate to it. I consider Ha as the stage, even though, like Paul Sensei said, it's to destroy or to break away. You build a form, you break the form. I see it more as an application stage, where we learn to take, we've got these basic forms, we've got the basic alphabet, the ABC, and we learn our basic formulas in the math class. And now you take that and you build a bridge. You know, you take it from the theory or from the form, and you start to apply it to new situations. And that's personally how I see the Ha stage. And then the Ri stage would be just the fruit of that. That, you know, you do that enough, and you really, really put in the time to study it, then it will internalize at some point and just become a natural expression. I tend to look at that stage more as a free stage, not to say that you're freedom from the forms, but forms and principles begin to express naturally as a fruit of Shu-Ha-Ri. And I think in our talk yesterday, you were also talking about the principles. So how does do principle and form interplay for you with these 3 stages?
Well, the principle and the form, of course, is dominant, but the form, so in Edo Yagyu Shinkage Ryu, we come in, and because most of us were not swordsmen to begin with, unlike in the old period, we have this set of kihon that we have to practice. Mm-hmm. And the kihon are these basic movements that teach us, you know, how to get up, how to sit down, proper reiki, where to put your sword, the distances for things, even how to get dressed. But there is a certain way to do it, and there's always this way we do it until you don't have to do it that way anymore. So we build upon that.
What determines that? Until you don't have to do it that way, what determines that?
Well, usually it would be the instructor. I remember I was doing something in the Kihon set, and I was imitating one of my instructors, and he would spread his legs apart and bend both knees, and I got yelled at. It was like, you can't do that until you're over 70. So if you're young, you got to lock out your knees. It's all force forward. This is the form, and not just the kata form, but the form your body must take to fit it. And of course, this is very interesting as a guy who's close to 6 foot tall and over 200 pounds with a room full of 5'5" guys who barely weigh 150 soaking wet. So that I had to always conform my body to what they wanted.
Right, until the teacher tells you otherwise.
Until the teacher tells you otherwise, yeah.
And I think this is what's important about Shu is because Shu is very much a, when do you graduate Shu? You graduate Shu when the authority, the external authority, the teacher, the one who's watching you and training you, when they say so.
Right.
At Shu stage, there's no self-graduation, which goes pretty much against our modern, especially Westerners. Individuality is a high value for Americans and certainly and also Europeans. Whereas in Japan, conformity is really the highest value over individuality.
Right.
And Shu is Shu-Ha-Ri, actually, is in everything, and Shu is there in everything. But you don't graduate, so-called graduate, or move on until the teacher says, okay, now you're ready.
Yes, exactly. And I use it exactly like my instructor uses it. I say, okay, now that you can do that so well, I want you to do it this way.
Right.
Which used to be really frustrating because you think, whoo, I got it. And then no, you don't have it yet. You got something new now. Mm-hmm. And a really good example for me, at least, is in our basic Kihon motions, the first draw that we all learn. So Yagyu Shinkage Ryu Edo, at least, because I have not seen a lot of the Owari Bato. And I'm sorry if I use terms that are different than some other people use. In our group, we never say Iaido. There's no real such thing as Iaido for us. We do Bato. But
Bato is Iai.
Yes, drawing the sword from the sheath is Bato.
And Owari, not Owari. What did you say?
Oh, yeah. In Owari, I haven't seen much of their Seigo Ryu. But
what is Owari? Can you describe what?
I'm sorry. Owari is how I break up Yagyu Shinkage Ryu. So Yagyu Shinkage Ryu, the two families, there was a split. Okay. When would it be? Sometime in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And so after the Edo kind of lost its prominence close to the Meiji Restoration, the Owari group definitely had much more of a pull. And so when people talk about Yagyu Shinkage Ryu, they usually mean Owari.
It's a school, it's a family name or a clan name or a stock?
It's an area name. So Nagoya was Owari.
Okay.
And so I was talking about the form of the cut. So when we start out our basic upward cut, we cut all the way through. When we pull the sword back above our head, and then we finish the second cut all the way down. Mm-hmm. And that is how everybody does it when they start. And after I can tell they can do that, then they have to bring the sword up center line and cut. And then eventually you follow the same line back on the cut. It becomes a Keisa cut instead of a Shoman cut. But it's that Shu-Ha-Ri principle, and it permeates not every section of the kata, from the basic Kihon kata all the way up to the Okuden. You have to learn it piece by piece until you really master that one little part, and then you get to change that little bit. Yeah, and that's the ha for me, the discovery.
What do you mean the discovery?
So the way we start the Kihon, or when we start in Shu, we see the kata, we learn the kata, and that is exactly what it is. It's what you see and you imitate it, right? But then within that, you find the hidden. You can find out, okay, this is what I'm doing. How am I doing it? How else does it translate? Where else can it fit? And so for me, that's the discovery.
It begins to eternalize.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's those little moments of satori where you're like, oh, I kind of get this now. I'm figuring something new out about it. And to me that, some people talk about Ri as that Satori moment, but I don't think of it that way. I think that comes before, because it's a lot of these little moments of discovery.
Right. And is there much focus on the principles? Like you have form, but then you move into principles or into the philosophy or tactics or something, some more subtle understanding of the art?
Yes, there absolutely is. There's times where we particularly will figure out, you're doing a kata, and most of our kata are paired against another long sword. But then certain kata, you realize, well, this applies to everything. This one kata alone can be done against every possible weapon or no weapon whatsoever. So yes, the form, but I mean, the principles can kind of take over, and then you can modify the footwork a little bit. You can change what you're doing. And of course, if you change weapon from long sword to short sword to tessen, you've changed your range. You have to adapt your body position, your footwork.
Right. And are there explicit principles that are taught in your tradition?
Yes. Yeah, there's specific principles, but they're very vague, and I think it's on purpose. It's because when you talk about it as a principle, like Suigetsu is a huge principle for us, and I know it is in a lot of other systems. But this idea of Suigetsu, the moon reflecting on the water,
right.
And we have to, of course, talk about this in pre-scientific time period. Meaning is that the moon reflecting on the water is instantaneous. Right? But another way of talking about this, because it can have multiple meanings, is the water must be still for the moon to reflect correctly. So I would get this Suigetsu comment all the time. And Suigetsu sometimes just means a target in the center of the chest. And then sometimes it means my reaction to the opponent. And sometimes it means how I'm supposed to compose myself.
And you had some. I'd shared with you the charts that I kind of use the way I use it in Aikido in my own school, and there was the concept of a narrow gate. There's a building up and where the conformity reaches a peak until some type of internalization happens, and then there starts to open up into more free expression. I mean, I'm speaking, of course, about Aikido. I don't know about the Ryu because there's still going to be a preservation of the kata in the form all the way up to Ri. But how does that play out in the way you teach or the way that you practice?
Sure. So we started out with 3 forms of study, I would call it. We started with kata geiko, kumiai geiko, and shiai geiko. And so the kata geiko is really, we're just doing the form. And then the second area, we're finding out the variations within the form that we can do. So it's almost a counter for counter kind of feeling.
And that's a partner practice, the kumiai.
I'm sorry.
The kumiai is a partner practice?
Yes. We do have a large selection of bato, but the heart of the art is the kenjutsu. It's the paired work.
Okay, so that's the kumiai, the paired thing. Okay.
And then the shiai geiko we call it the habiki. We would try these techniques then with dulled steel. And it becomes more of a shiai type of feeling.
Shiai being competition.
Yes.
Okay, so you go head to head with somebody.
Yes, but not in the way that you would strap on armor and take practice swords and go for that. That will come out in the middle area, because we'll use Fukuro Shinai. So in Yagyu Shinkage Ryu, we use the leather wrapped Shinai.
Yeah. No.
And but we don't wear armor, and it's more of a, what I'm going to do, I know what you're going to do, and we're going to do it as best we can and as hard and as fast as we can. Then sometimes we'll vary it. And again, of course, this is why the instructor's position is so important. It's really up to the person who's teaching the lower rank to kind of up that volume, right? To push it up to their next level. But eventually, and I do this with my own students, is we'll take dull swords and we'll go for it, but nothing's prearranged. Let's just see what kind of happens.
Right.
And of course, we're practicing stopping, not trying to cleave into the person.
Right. So tell me, what is Shu-Ha-Ri for you? What is the fruit of somebody who's been through that? Because Shu-Ha-Ri, we were speaking yesterday, and there's a certain amount of baby. It's very often the baby's been thrown out with the bathwater.
Right.
And so the bathwater being the old traditional ways,
Mhm.
were taken over by modern ways, modern education, even postmodern education. So those old ways were passed away. But what is the baby? What's the baby of Shu-Ha-Ri that's been thrown out with the bathwater?
I guess it's this constant cycle of being able to reevaluate your position. You know, by using Shu-Ha-Ri, you can always go back and look at yourself. Where am I right now? Today, this moment, on this form, on another form, in my life, anything in general. And it's we mentioned yesterday that I don't consider Shu-Ha-Ri this progression. It's not a linear progression. It's a circle. It's a continuously repeating and sometimes going backwards kind of flow, kind of like the inspiration, motivation, action. And the nice thing about inspiration, motivation, and action is you can jump in at any time. And after a while, after you've gone through, as we discussed yesterday, is you've gone through one cycle of this, form, separate from the form just happens. When you get back, you can jump in there any place you like and just kind of reevaluate from there.
Maybe you say something about inspiration, motivation, and action. Can you describe that sequence?
Sure. So most people think that I need to get inspired to give me some motivation to take an action. But the truth is we can just be motivated. It's discipline. But if you dig, you find the motivation and you do. Or if you lack the first two, just do it, right? Just get out and do it. And that is going to lead to inspiration and motivation. If you do something you didn't want to do, you tend to be inspired to do more, and that motivates you and you do more. So it's that continuous circle, and we don't have to do it in a linear way. We don't have to, it's not numbered. We can just jump in and do it however we like.
Yeah, that's something you and I were talking about yesterday. I mean, because I see Shu-Ha-Ri as a linear process. Actually, I just see it as it's just a natural maturity that happens that we can identify through. If we look when we're going through it, it's not the case. But if we look back, we can say, yeah, there was that stage, and there was that stage, and there was that stage. And I do see it as a linear process on the first run,
Right.
to really move through, at least through Shu and Ha. But then it becomes like you said, a circular, there's kind of a learning cycle of discovery where we go back and we go back and go back. What do you mean by that? Because you mentioned this circle a few times.
Yeah. So like you, I feel when you first get into any art, you start in and you're just doing the kata, and usually you're struggling, right, to kind of take these concepts and absorb them. And eventually you get through and you kind of feel like it's internalized. And then you go back and you start that whole cycle back over again. And, it doesn't matter how many years I've been doing Yagyu or Aikido or any of the arts that I do, I always go back to my basics. I always go back to my form and reevaluate and rejudge. And especially now as I'm starting to get a little bit older, what are the things that I must change?
Yeah.
What can I not quite do the way I used to do, and how is that going to affect it? So it's like this. I was trying to think of a neat little infographic I could come up with it, but it's this line that then gets into this loop, right? But the loop only doesn't go in one direction. You can get into that shu ha shu back and forth, and it can be a stutter step, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a reevaluation process.
Yeah.
If we're really going to internalize it, we have to reevaluate.
Yeah, I agree. And not only that, I mean, again, if I just speak linear for a moment, I think when we move from one stage to the next, if the previous stage is a solid, stable foundation, then the next stage can evolve quite naturally. But if you move into the next stage and it's just not happening, in a way, you've got to go back. You've got to go back to the previous stage,
Sure.
solidify, strengthen that stage, and then sometimes evolution needs to back up to like solidify more, and then it can continue forward and growth.
Right. And the only thing that would really prevent us from doing that, like we were talking about yesterday, is our ego, right? When you're moving in this line, you feel like you're going up that hill and you just want to keep going up that hill to attain something. But if you start looking at it more as a process and less of a goal, you should be happy to go back and look at this and think how much better you've gotten rather than what you've attained.
Well, that's a beautiful, Japanese, not just Japanese, but Asian Confucian philosophy that, you always humble yourself to something that's greater than you. And the ego doesn't stand up, which in the West, we tend to have a preference towards that. In the old Shu-Ha-Ri model, that gets it gets tamed, and eventually it gets kind of ground down.
Right.
And I mean that in a good way.
Mhm.
Sometimes it can, you were in Japan. Sometimes it can be quite brutal. It can be hazing. It can be, it can go wrong.
Yeah.
But when it's done well, the ego gets ground down, and then what's left is really a full expression of the art.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and it can be quite demoralizing. If we go to that inspiration motivation section, you
Mhm.
can get really. I remember I had been training in Yagyu and well, I've been training in Osaka for about 2.5 years or so. And one of my favorite teachers, Sugihara Sensei, he's what I call a master of the old guard. We sat down one night and figured out all the Dan ranks he possessed, and I think he had in the 60s because he had his multiple high rank in judo, in aikido, in kendo. I think he was a okuden in Shinomusoryu.
Mhm.
He was a high level rank in Tenichido. But we were training one day, and he looks at me and he says to me, "Naka naka jozu." And I thought, in my limited Japanese, I thought, "Whew, all right, I'm doing all right." And I got home and I said to my wife, she's like, "Oh, how was your practice?" I was like, "Oh, it was good." Sugihara Sensei said, "Naka naka jozo." And she's like, "Yeah, that doesn't mean what you think it means." So for the non-Japanese speakers, right? Naka naka jozo means naka naka means, at least especially in Osaka dialect, it's like it's not bad.
Somehow,
Right?
yeah.
So yeah, and jozo means good. So not bad, good, but really means that's the best you can do. I guess that's the best I can expect from you. Yeah, it's pretty bad when you hear it and you have to go back and but then you go back on the loop and start again.
So okay. So what would you say is the necessary to move from one stage to the next, to move from shu to ha? Of course, like you said, the determining factor will be your teacher. So the determination comes from the outside, and then your teacher says, okay, now you're going to start to move into ha, whatever. They actually train with you in a different way. There may
Right.
be new practices, new bodies of waza, or new bodies of understanding that you'll move into, or they'll just start training with you they'll kind of shift gears and change in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's more of a shift gears kind of thing. It
That's right.
so into a certain extent, one in my experience, one of the ways I experienced it was I was given more responsibility. So it was almost a joke back then that new guys that came into the dojo, I would get them to teach them Kihon. And this was a test for me to see if I knew it, but it was also a test for them. Can these guys handle learning from the foreigner in this traditional art while they're getting pushed off to the side? So that was like a test. They used me for multiple purposes like that. And then once you get a little bit of that, you get a little more experience. But then of course, the next time you go up with your instructor, you get the volume turned up. You realize that, okay, I must be doing something. At first you think I did something to anger him, but then you kind of realize that I must be doing something right because he's cranking it up on me.
Yeah, and they have to turn up the volume. They have to. The horizon has to be pushed away. You need to be challenged again in order to grow, and it should be just like a video game when you kill all the aliens at one level for a couple of days. I kill them. I go to the next level, and suddenly it's like I can't do it anymore. Not that I play video games, but
Yeah.
when I was younger, I did. But it's very much the same thing. When you go to the next level, it should be quite literally feel like, wow, now I'm doing this again. Shit, I'm a beginner again. I'm doing this for the first time.
Right, right. And some of the responsibilities, I remember back in Japan, Sono Sensei had to go to a shrine to do a demonstration. And everybody's like, okay, who's Tachioki? Who's going to carry your bags for you, buy your tickets, do all those kind of things? And he said, Paul's going to take care of it this time. And I'm like, oh, all right then. And then I thought, I'm getting dirt work again. It's like I'm already here cleaning the dojo all the time and taking care of the new guys, and now I got to carry the bags. But also, as soon as you carry the bags and you get there, and there's only two of you, you realize I'm also the punching dummy.
Yeah, right.
And it was very interesting for him at his level of demonstrating for these things. He would just say, "Okay, you do these attack. I'm going to do these tessen techniques." I was like, "Okay, what attack do you want?" He was like, "I don't care. You just go ahead." he says, you attack where I look open. So this was a constant, not just turning up the volume when we train together, but turning up the volume with my perception. So it's like constantly tweaking and twisting and trying to find exactly what's going to help push me up a little bit further.
So for the hot stage, again, we're just going to move slowly through this. For the hot stage, as I said before, I see it as an application stage that we take the basics that we learned in the previous stage and we start to apply it in new and more complex and sometimes even unusual situations. It could be with taking multiple attackers, or what we did in the hand before. Now you add weapons. It's the same thing. It's the same forms, the same principles, but you're starting to apply it in more ways. And you're also an Aikido teacher, so you know that in Aikido we have lots of different directions to go with this. What is more the hot stage, the actual nuts and bolts of the practice like in Aikido Shinkage Ryu?
Yeah, it's well, I can give my definition for it. This is not something I think I ever spoke about with my instructor. It's not something he would never say, well, you've reached this level now and you've got this. But it was again, subtle tests, and I do this to my my students, and there's a couple of them on this call, so they'll recognize it. They know the game. That is, where is Sensei? Right? If you don't know where I am in the room, you've made a huge tactical error. Yeah. Because I'm probably behind you. And it's a game I play. I walk around to test their awareness. And for our kind of training, especially with bladed weapons in a small crowded room with 10, 12 people at a time sometimes, awareness is key, right? But when you start to get that, when we're doing kata, this is all we can see. And we expand our perception. And that's just kind of one way to play with it. But it's not, for me, ha is one of those things that it's not just hard to define. It's like, how do we even put it in a box? It's so encompassing because it's not, and we spoke about this briefly yesterday. I put shu and ha in the kata box. Right. And then I put ri in the waza box. So I very rarely use the word waza. Mm-hmm. It can be, and for Aikido terminology, we can use henka or kaishi waza, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's an energy involved and we have to deal with the energy. Mm-hmm. And so in the same way, we don't fight with swords. So how do we apply this to other things? So how are our reflexes? How is our physical strength and our flexibility, our tolerance to, or let's call it our stoicism, right? Not tolerance to pain necessarily, but can you sit in that freezing cold environment and just ignore it? Right. We would go up to Yagi no Sato and do these gashuku in the temple, and just down the hill from the top of the temple is a kendo dojo. So we would eat, sleep, and train there, and the priest would come in twice a day, and we would do zazen, and they would the guys would tease me. They're like, well, you're a foreigner, your feet go numb fast, so you don't even notice it. I was like, I don't think you've had your feet go numb before. You really notice that. I'm just able to endure more, I'm willing to endure more so that he will just walk past me and not whack me. So that was another kind of, adapting my training and the techniques and things I learned into it. And in Shinkage Ryu, particularly because we're a Kage Ryu derivative, we're trying to learn to hide our intent. Right? The Kage of Shinkage is kind of deception. It's not my favorite word to use for it, but
Kage meaning shadow.
Yes, yeah. So we'll often talk about the shadow of the moon and the shadow of the mountain, and the shadow of the mountain has these physical characteristics, and the shadow of the moon has these moral, psychological, tactical kind of applications to it. So it's, again, you're trying to take these kind of obscure terms that we use for one-on-one combat and apply them to more than just that, because Yagyu Shinkage Ryu in particular we are not a do, we are a hyoho, or a strategic system. So you have to be able to start taking them and putting it into other things. And that's where I think the ha starts to express itself. And of course, with a group like the Yagyu being involved with the Tokugawa shogunate, the internal politics and intrigue was how do you navigate these things using these principles? How can you influence battlefield combat using these principles? So it's a very wide-ranging thing, but I don't think Ha is really something that we talk about in practice because it's application.
Like you were saying before about having spatial awareness. I mean that's something I also teach. I teach it in the Shu stage, but I fully knowing that beginner students, even a student that's been training 1 or 2 years, fully knowing that they're going to lose it the moment they get occupied with how their feet goes or what's going on in front of them. They're going to lose it. I mean, there's no question. That's what defines a person. That's one of the defining factors of when you're still at that stage.
Sure.
And then as that's stable, then as again, I talked about the hostage as an application, starting to apply that to more situation, multiple attackers, the awareness starts to open up, and then it begins gradually, slowly to become 360 in a way. What would you say is that's just one, and for me, that's a developmental move of more complexity. So, I've got my own kind of egocentric perspective here. Now I'm able to open up and take in more and more potential possibilities, more and more perspectives. So that kind of move is like we move into more complexity. What would you say, if there is a way to say this, it's just a question, what would you say defines how a person moves from Ha to Ri?
I guess one way that I can think about it within the context of my own sword art is that, we start practicing and we're usually against one opponent, but most of our kata will eventually involve more opponents. And sometimes we'll have up to 4 or 5 surrounding us in this preformed kata that we're dealing with. So your attention goes from just you to you and your opponent, to you and the opponents, and to the chessboard at large, I guess I would call it.
That's beautiful. That's awesome. So in a way, playing 3-dimensional chess.
Yes.
Now you've got the whole board that's part of your awareness and consciousness.
Right. And I talk about it with some of my students who have done other arts, and they always use the reference, or 2 or 3 of them have used the same reference. So I like to use it too now. It's like checkers versus chess, right? When you just have this very simple movement of pieces and you have a very, we can go this way, and that's about it. But then I don't really need to set up moves that far in advance in checkers. Whereas in chess, usually, really high level players, which I am not, can set up the board way ahead of time. Within moving 3 pieces, they kind of know what's going to happen. And in swordsmanship, this should be true as well. Of course, there's always the unexpected, but I should be getting you to do what I want you to do, and for an Aikido principle, though modern Aikidoists don't like to hear this, but O Sensei, when he said, the art of Aiki is getting the opponent to do what you want him to do, really rang true for me as a Kodyu practitioner. It's like, I want to manipulate my opponent into doing what I want him to do so that I know I can win.
Paul, what would you say would be the I suppose even Gendai Budo I suppose even Kodyu can be taught in a modern way, because, most of the students that are coming in are bringing that modern consciousness. We're all educated in a modern way. What would you say is the benefits of working with Shu-Ha-Ri, even for modern practitioners?
I just think it adds so much depth to our training. I'm honestly at the point now where I can't imagine not using Shu-Ha-Ri to teach. Even when I was training in Filipino martial arts, in the Filipino martial arts, there's this concept of see, feel, do. And it's the same thing. It's Shu-Ha-Ri, just in a different format. You see it, you kind of get the idea of it, and then you feel it, you get to experience what it feels like, and then you do it. But do it doesn't necessarily mean this perfected do it. It just means, you're doing it. So at this point, I can't imagine even wanting to bother trying to study a classical martial art without, or any martial art really. I don't want to use any arts in particular because I don't want to insult anybody, but there's so many arts that especially get sport based, right? That kind of lose that, right? They throw out, like we were talking about, the baby with the bathwater, and let's focus on getting these points and doing these moves and all that.
Yeah, because it's sport and it's competition. And
Yeah,
it's a different perspective with a different objective, with a different mentality, and it's fine as it is.
sure.
But Shu-Ha-Ri also respects the hierarchy. There's something that you've got to go through. Whereas in sports, the individual can become the strongest, fastest, most badass person in the room,
Right.
and then win the gold medal.
Right.
But that's not bad, but it's not Shu-Ha-Ri.
It's not Shu-Ha-Ri, and I still don't think it's the best way. You know, it's so Toby and I have both done Muay Thai, and actually we had one of the same instructors, and that is one of those things where it is a sport. It is a very brutal sport, but it is a sport. And but you are still playing a chess game. You are still developing your skills from a very basic level to much more advanced ways until, you know, a very high level guy can get you to fall right into the spot where he just wants to knock you out. And that still requires that kind of polishing, you know, that grinding way that you were talking about before.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
see that as a huge part of it. In fact, the name of my Aikido dojo is the Rensei Kan, which means to polish through repetition.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful.
Grinding waypoint.
You know, it also occurs to me, if we look at the interface between modern and traditional, you know, modern is really about the individual. You know, I go out there and I get what I can. In a way, I can watch a traditional art, and I can, quote unquote, steal the secrets. It's not stealing the technique, not the old school stealing the technique. I can go and I can steal the secrets, but it's really there's going to be a whole a developmental system that's missing there.
Right.
And I think what that developmental system does more than anything else, not only does it give you the internalization of the art, but it shapes your character.
Yes.
In a way that you know, modern sports, of course, also shape our character. But there's a certain, you know, the old school traditions really kind of shape it in a very specific way. And like you said, there's a certain stoicism to it that builds you as a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. And without that, I wonder if you're able to encompass the art if you do not have that moral character. If you have not built that moral character into it, can you encompass the art that you're being taught?
Yeah, I don't think you can. You can copy it, but and people, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but somebody who knows, who also has that I mean, in a way, the only way to determine another person's moral character is if you also have a certain development in your own moral character. There's like an old saying from an old story from Ura Senkei, the tea school, because I also did tea ceremony when I was in Japan. And the grandmaster had his student clean the garden. And, you know, in tea ceremony, you spend hours with the preparation, cleaning, kiyomeru, purification. And he cleaned one of these Japanese gardens with, with the little maples and there's moss and there's dirt, and he cleaned, it was perfectly clean. And he made sure there was nothing that his teacher could criticize. And his teacher, and he, finally when he was done, his teacher came and he said, "Look, it's perfect." And the teacher looked. There was not a speck of, there was nothing wrong with it. And the teacher said, "It's good, but it's not perfect."
Right.
And he reached over and he grabbed the maple, the little, like Canadian maples, a big leaf, a little Japanese maple is small. He grabbed the maple and he gave it a quick shake, and maybe a dozen or so leaves fell down on the ground. And he said, "Now it's perfect." And that's Ri. Now you and I can hear that story and I can go shake a tree and say, "Look, it's perfect," but it's not the same thing. And somebody who knows that will be able to see it.
Yeah.
You can't fake Ri.
And one of the hardest parts about, the traditional Japanese arts and this system is heel, right? That criticism. Because
say it again, heel?
Heel, yeah. The criticism from your instructor. And it never stops. I don't think I was ever complimented by my instructor.
Right.
And
the critical eye, the critical, there's always something to purify, to polish, to sharpen.
Always.
Absolutely.
And there's a really good, I saw a great example of it. My mother was an opera lover. I used to watch Pavarotti with her all the time. And he had this show on PBS for a little while where he would stand by the piano and one of the new upcoming sopranos would come out and sing. And he would listen to them. And sometimes they'd come out and they'd sing and he goes, "Thank you so much. That was lovely." And they would walk off stage. And then other people come out and he would rip them to pieces. And then he'd make them do it again. And then he'd rip it up again. And then he'd make them do it again. And only years later did I realize he didn't give a damn about those other people.
Yeah,
He
right.
wasn't going to waste his time
Yeah,
because he's an artist, right? And
yeah.
you know, people joke whenever I say I'm an artist. I am. I'm just a martial artist. My art's a little more violent than yours, but it's an art.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Well, once again, I want to allow some space for people to ask questions. I see Ella Sensei has joined us as well. I see George opened his mic. Hey, George. Sensei.
That last piece just rang true for me. I trained with Satomi Sensei for 30 years before he ever said anything that I construed as what would represent positive feedback. And it was so radical when he did it that I did this double take, and it was kind of like, oh my God, aliens have stolen my teacher. What have you done with him? People don't, I have to explain it to people sometimes, within the Aikido context, because they don't, a lot of Americans they train with the Japanese teachers, but they don't train all the time. So they're not imbued with kind of how the game works. And I've tried to explain to them that, sometimes when the teacher comes by and he looks at what you're doing and he smiles and he walks off, that was not the good thing. When he's on your case, when he's really on your case, that's the good thing, because he still thinks there's hope for you. And it's hard to explain that to people who didn't kind of, grow up with it on a daily basis.
Well, I mean, it's counterintuitive. It's only when you really get into that kind of those hard moments, especially with a teacher who's kind of holding your feet to the fire. It's like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Everything else was really just kind of, preparing the ground. Now we're actually getting somewhere. It's the same thing with meditation. People want to meditate, and you with a little bit of practice, you can get a good level of mindfulness and concentration, have some interesting states. But only when it starts to kind of go through a deeper purification is the practice going to start to become a struggle again. And that's the most interesting part of the practice. That's where the real career development is happening, because there's a purification happening. Right. Paul, do you speak about purification in your view? Or explicitly? I mean, I'm sure it's happening all the time.
No, we did focus a bit on some zazen, but as a form of purification. But again, my system over the years seems to have drifted a bit more towards the Buddhism and away from the esoteric Shintoism. And I think there probably was more of a purification idea back then.
Interesting. So was it Shintoism originally?
Oh, sure. All of the Koryo were Shinto at one time. And the Yagyu, they were the protectors of the Kasumi Shrine in Nara. And I think that might still be true. I'm not sure exactly. Sure. Yeah. But we had, of course, a direct connection with Mikyo Buddhism. But because of Munenori and Takuan Soho and the influx of Buddhism, that really seemed to take precedence. It's not that we ignore the Shinto deities. It's just it doesn't have as much weight as the experiential.
Right.
My explanation for that I got from an instructor, and I still use today, is when you talk about Buddhist priests and Shinto priests and the differences, and the Shinto priests only care about the gods. The Buddhist priests only care about you. Right? They want you to find something. The Shinto priests they don't care as long as you throw a couple coins in the box. Their job is to make the gods happy, not to make you happy.
Exactly. Or to be more precise, the Buddhists care more about not you. I think Toby had opened up his mic.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so much influence in Shindo Yoshinryu from Shinkage Ryu that one of the subjects Paul and I can talk about all the time is how Shinkage Ryu has influenced other schools, and in particular influenced us. But we went the other direction. So Shindo Yoshinryu is much more Shinto-centric than it is Buddhist-centric. In fact, when Buddhism shows up, it shows up as sort of that syncretic influence upon Shinto that happened accidentally, and we bring into Shindo Yoshinryu almost as the caboose on the train. But really, we're mostly Shinto-centric. So Shinto is the driver of the ethos and morality and all the mythology that we use. But it's interesting, every time Paul talks about this, I catch all these similarities between what we do in Shindo Yoshinryu and what they do in Yagyu Shinkage Ryu, because we have so much influence. The sword side of our art is almost totally influenced by Kashima Shinto Ryu, Kashima Jiki Shinkage Ryu, and a school that's less well known called Matsuzaki Shinkage Ryu. But they're all out of the Shinkage Ryu lines, and those influences are very, very easy to see. They have a certain flavor. And the very first time I met Paul, that was the first thing we noticed when we were conversing with one another, is how similar our sword work was, and how similar the underlying or the aura of the art is. And so it's really good to hear him talk about this. I find a lot of it very interesting.
When was there a divergence in the schools into separate streams?
The divergence is it was that the founder of Shindo Yoshinryu was a student of Jiki Shinkage Ryu, and so that was a big influence on the art. And so a lot of the higher level licenses we issue, the kata are pulled right out of Jiki Shinkage Ryu. The symbolism on the upper level, our Gokui and our Okugi scrolls, is right out of Jiki Shinkage Ryu or Matsuzaki Shinkage Ryu. The Yoshinryu influence is less obvious in the upper level teachings. It's more like the strategy, the mindset, and the tactics, the hey-ho, like Paul was talking about. They influence the Yoshinryu more than Yoshinryu influenced the sword work. So the jujitsu side of the art is imbued with this Shinkage Ryu. It's fascinating stuff. And if you don't dig into these things in any depth, you don't really see it. You're blind to it.
Right.
Hakamura was very, very overt in the way he taught us this stuff. And I liked also what Paul was talking about, where you have morality is interwoven with all this stuff. And in Shindo Yoshinryu, the morality is interwoven into Shu-Ha-Ri. The way we teach it, the way we, there's certain myths that are in our school that are used to pass the ethos of the school forward. And even the way those myths are taught and interpreted is influenced by Shu-Ha-Ri.
Right. Well, we're going to save that for next week, Toby. but it's a wonderful teaser. I'm curious about the ranks, because I know in Kodyu, also for Toby, also I suppose Ellis as well, and for Paul, that they don't do the Dan ranks and the Q ranks, but rather the Menkyo, that you're awarded a scroll at a certain stage. Do those represent in any way that could be along the lines of Shu-Ha-Ri?
I don't think of it that way, but maybe in other reporting they do.
No, I don't think of it that way either. It's more of the Shu-Ha-Ri really stays as part of the dojo training, less than the teaching certification. I mean, obviously, if they can't, the person you're awarding the certificate to, let's say, a Chuden Menkyo, if they can't use Shu-Ha-Ri to explain the principles that they really themselves understand, then they don't deserve the certificate. But it's not part of it.
Right. So it's not like a ranking system in that sense of stages of maturity. Ellis Sensei, please.
Well, first of all, as I said in my presentation, in neither the Kodyu that I trained was Shu-Ha-Ri an explicitly stated thing. Honestly, the ranking system is the matrix of which it's, or at least should be, the matrix at which one evaluates these levels. So instead of Shu-Ha-Ri in Arakiryu, you have Kirigami, Mokoroku, Inkajo, and Zekkoku Menkyo. And then you've got a more complex thing in Toda-Habukodyu, because you've got parallel rankings for teachers as opposed to your level of ability. So, in other words, I think of Shu-Ha-Ri as an intellectual matrix applied to something living. It's a taxonomy. And in that sense, the ranking itself could be a taxonomy, where Shu-Ha-Ri was imported from outside. It's not inherent the founders of various Ryu didn't say, and in our curriculum, we're going to have Shu-Ha-Ri. Somewhere along the line, that discourse, which was part of Japanese discourse, particularly around Zen-influenced art, that discourse was considered something useful. And so people started describing things that way.
So you're saying it's more of a Zen-influenced artisans or craftsmen's discourse? That's
my belief. Yeah. It's the fact that something like No or a lot of Zen-influenced arts, that's a very explicit kind of discourse, whereas many Koryu, I have no idea how many do, how many don't, but even when I heard the term, it's like, oh, that's something from outside that's useful. Just Ogasawara Ryu has, and my teacher used this idea of calligraphy. I mentioned this Kaisho, Gyosho, Sosho, which certainly wasn't inherent in Aikido, but this is a useful way to describe states of development. And so it's an import, I see it, right? And that doesn't, in no sense does that trivialize it,
right?
Any more than the Araki-ryu I learned has a whole set of principles that were borrowed from Yagyu Shinkage Ryu, interestingly enough. So again, there's a, and that's now part of us. We imported it from somewhere else, and it's now part of us.
Yeah. So when you say imported, it's more like incorporated and integrated into part and parcel of the arts.
Yeah.
And we're talking about something we're a few centuries ago. Like
well, actually, that was about 150 years ago, I guess.
Right. Great.
Yeah. But that stuff goes. If you train more than one thing, that's going to happen. Exactly. The things I train are infected with each other to a degree. I do my level best to at least be conscious of that or not let that happen, but it does happen. Now, by the way, there was one point that sort of struck my consciousness, and that was morality, the discussion on morality. First of all, it's another one of these words that people say, oh, that must mean being a good person. And morality is attached to the word virtue, which is Latin roots are in strength. So stoicism, psychopaths can be stoic.
Right.
Caravaggio, who was probably in modern terms a psychopath, was one of the most brilliant artists of the Renaissance. And you can't see the moral depravity of his personal life in the art. Or you look at Ravel and Debussy, and for people who aren't really familiar with the music, both those impressionist musicians, composers, they sound somewhat similar. Ravel was a lovely human being. Debussy was so horrible that his wife decided to kill herself and drank poison. Debussy found her, and the first thing he did when he found her prostrate on the floor was start ruffling through her clothes to find her purse instead of calling for help, which in her semi-conscious state, she was so furious, she vowed to live so she could leave him. Right? but the thing is, who was a better composer? Whose art was better? You do not detect in Debussy's art his nastiness, right? It's beautiful music. Yeah. And so there's an interesting thing about that. Picasso was a horrible man. A lot of those distorted pictures of women crying are him actually painting realistic pictures of his own girlfriends as he tormented them, right? Psychologically, right? But he was a brilliant artist. So I think one has to be careful in applying morality in the common way we use it in terms of good human, good behavior, kind to small animals kind of morality. Right? I think that virtue is a word that is a little bit more value neutral, which, that to achieve Shu-Ha-Ri, one needs to have certain virtues.
So I'm going to save that for the panel discussion because, somebody can be highly developed martially and still be an asshole. Forgive my French. And so gone through Shu-Ha-Ri. So let's look at that a little bit later in our panel discussions. I think you're opening up an interesting point that would be beneficial for all of us who are kind of walking on a path. Maybe what we can do to wrap up, and I want to ask Paul first, but other people may have something to say about it. I think it was Paul and I, or Toby and I, were recently speaking. Shu-Ha-Ri it is a valuable system, and yet it has been it's maybe known on omote, as Toby was telling me, that the externally, but the ura, the deeper insight of Shu-Ha-Ri is largely we don't see it that much. I don't want to say it's lost, but we don't hear about it that much. And personally, I think it's because we've moved from traditional into modern and a whole new education systems. But why would you say that Shu-Ha-Ri is not so deeply grasped?
I think because it's hard. It's difficult. We were talking about this the other day with some of my Aikido people, and we were talking about sushi. One of the guys, he loves sushi. He wants to go to Japan and become a sushi chef. I was like, dude, you're in your late 40s. It's not going to happen.
Next lifetime.
You don't have that much life left.
Being born as a Japanese, and then
I was like, well, first you got to go there and you get to wash the rice for the first year or two. Yeah. I was like, first of all, I don't think you're ready to do that. And he was like, well, why would I have to wash the rice? I was like, right there means you don't get it, right? You are not ready to sharpen your chisel or wash the rice. Then what is the point? It's just a very difficult, whole concept to swallow before you can even think about getting better at it.
That's great. That's a great example. Yeah. You might as well just go to YouTube and learn how to do sushi. It's quicker and
sure. Yeah,
but it's not Shu-Ha-Ri. Toby, did you want to say something about this?
It's okay.
Well, why do you think it's Shu-Ha-Ri is not so? It's not being transmitted or not grasped?
Well, I think it's just. I think the same thing Paul says. It's too hard. I mean, I mentioned this the other day when we were talking. I really ran into Shu-Ha-Ri when I was in college because I went to a famous photography school. And the process the school taught me was just how an apprentice is taught by a master craftsman. So the first year of training there was no creativity allowed at all. You were learning to be a master of the craft of photography. And we lost 60 or 70% of the students in the first year because
that's why exactly. Yeah.
And I think it's too hard. I mean, everybody used to ask me, it was funny, people would ask me about Takamura all the time after Stan's interview with him when he kind of first became known. Mm-hmm. And they were like, why didn't Takamura have more students? Why was he so obscure? Why did he only have like 25 people ever training with him? And I was like, 25 people was insane. That was when we had the most. That was as big as it got. Usually it was 7. Mm. And it was because he was so harsh on you at the beginning. He didn't care where you came from. He didn't care what you did. When you walked through the door, you better drop everything at the door. You talk about having an empty cup. And if you didn't have an empty cup, it was going to be hell on you. Fortunately, because of my training in photography, when I walked in, I recognized the model. And I understood the benefits already. So I knew what I was in for. I think most people don't know what they're in for. So that's one of the reasons Shu-Ha-Ri is so rare now.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. Maybe we'll open up to George or Ellis. But I agree that it's hard, but I think it's even less about hard because, most martial artists can do some hard stuff. But I think it's the level of investment in loss, because we're investing in loss for a good few years before we start to even acquire something. And that's something that I think most modernists, for sure postmodernists, are not, that's just not that's not the way we're wired.
Well, and your ego too. I think ego has a lot.
There you go. Yeah, that's why we need to invest in loss.
I mean, because you have to, you basically have to invest also in giving your ego to somebody else.
Right, which is not really valued in our culture.
Yeah, it's not the way people want to operate. They're not willing to subject their ego to somebody else's authority.
Right. George, do you have a take on this? Why is Shu-Ha-Ri so not so grasped by so many?
Well, everybody keeps talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. And on some level, I guess I would maintain that Aikido as an art was an art that started, you know, post baby being thrown out. You know, we're in a sense trying to rediscover some of this stuff for ourselves. And, you know, my limited exposure to Koryu has helped me frame some of the ways I think about what we do and to try and put it back in. But no, it's difficult. And, you know, I don't think people understand it very well. And, you know, just this, the talking about the training itself, you know, most dojos these days are, you know, they have to be larger. They have to be, you got to have a certain number of students to pay the rent. You know, if you're not doing it out of your garage or on your property or something. So it changes things. And, you know, when I started Aikido, you're talking about the whole ego at the door thing. It was made very apparent to me immediately upon walking into the dojo that there were really only two things that I was required to say. Yes and thank you. That was it. And that covered you for everything. If sensei said this, you said yes and thank you. And you weren't there to express your own opinion. You weren't there to argue. You weren't there to do anything. And so every time somebody, you know, if sensei spoke to you, you said thank you because it was a gift. And, you know, if he said to do something, you basically said yes. Now, I mean, I would say that you have to be careful about that. Ellis has written extensively about the need to be judicious about it. And, you know, I was fortunate to train with somebody that I don't feel like I had to compromise my own values on that. You know, he wasn't a perfect human being, my teacher, but he did not require me to compromise my values by staying. So that's always difficult because, you know, this whole thing of check your ego at the door can be a trap, and it can be abused by teachers who are not of the right character. So, you know, it's good. That's the good part about being a Westerner, is that you do most of the time, I think, have a certain tendency to question. But, you know, if you've got the right teacher, then, you know, basically for a really long time, you just shut up and train. And, you know, that's hard for people.
Yeah. Well, therein lies the
Miles,
rub.
did anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we did have a question here from Karsten. And Karsten Himholtz, you want to open your mic, Karsten?
Yeah, thank you.
Hamburg, no?
Wow, very good memory. Thank you. Yes. It's not so much a question, it's just something that came up recently when I was talking with some of the people I train with, and we were talking about teaching and being taught about this whole idea of checking the ego at the door, submitting to teacher's authority, giving up oneself to a certain degree. And this all, if you put all that together, it can sound pretty daunting, I think, especially to people who are not used to that kind of teaching. And what I was missing in that conversation, and what I would like to bring up here, is the issue of trust. Something George led to when he said, "It's well, I have to hope for a good teacher. I have to trust him with my physical health, because, you know, we're dealing with potentially dangerous weapons and techniques. But I also have to trust him with my I don't know, maybe call it spiritual health or something." So making sure that he's not a psychopath and making sure that he does not teach me to be one.
Yeah, it's pretty clear. Okay, so trust goes both ways. Nothing goes both ways in Shu-Ha-Ri. It goes one way from top to bottom. But Paul, do you want to? There is something on trust. You want to make a comment on that?
Oh, sure. I mean, Ellis was touching on the point about morality, and I like that thing you're saying about virtue as a replacement for the morality term, because, you know, when we talk about morality, it's very tough, especially with the Koryu arts, because we're talking about systems designed to kill people. So immediately when you're talking about cutting things off and chopping people in half, so morality becomes a difficult word for it. So, you know, it's funny. my instructor would talk about the angle the blade goes in and the different ways you cut with a sword on a human body. And, this sounds really psychopathic, but if you understand the context of what you're learning, it's not so bad. But I tend to tone this down for my Aikido students. That's the students who have trained with me in both say that there's a radical difference in the methodology. Whereas if I teach this one thing to the sword people, this is the way we cut them in half. And in the Aikido concept is this is the way we position our bodies in space. So you kind of change the emphasis. But I think I strayed off of his point a little bit, but that was what I got out of it.
Ellis, you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah. So yes, trust is an issue, but again, one can be ahistorical. As a modern human being with pretty conventional modern values in terms of morality, I would like my students to be able to trust me to do right by them and all that kind of stuff. But if we go back to where these concepts were originated, far more important than trust was loyalty.
Right.
And, you lived in a society where the way you protested your superior's malfeasance was not to revolt, or maybe not to even object, but to cut open your belly to hopefully shame them. Right? Now, very often it's like, okay, you cut open his belly, I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing, but that was all you had. And that the concept of immortality in that culture was primarily what name you're going to leave behind, because in any sense, if you besmirched your name in terms of loyalty, your family and all those who follow you would lose their position, would be impoverished, would lose their station in life. And so loyalty was a value far greater than a kind of mutual trust of, I know you're going to take care of me. And so one of the virtues is stemi. And stemi is throwing oneself extravagantly away, so to speak. And, hopefully you're going to come to a good landing, but the important thing is throwing yourself away without reservation. And there's that level of loyalty to your tradition or to your teacher. Now, in actual fact, were many Japanese on battlefield treacherous? Were many people manipulative? All those things are true, but in terms of the intellectual frame of this, I agree as a modern human that the trust is so important. And I have a profound responsibility to not cause damage to the people who have literally honored me to want to learn from me. But in terms of the classical tradition, there were other virtues that were considered more important than a teacher who is going to do right by you, or your students are going to do right by you.
Yeah, and if you lined up with a trustworthy teacher, you would only find out at the end after many years, and in a way you were lucky. Maybe you had a mentor or father that said, this is the guy to train with, but basically there wasn't much choice. That was not really an issue.
Right. So, your own teacher, Saito Sensei, that story about on his wedding day, returns from the wedding and his new wife is now supposed to start attending to Mrs. Ueshiba. They didn't even have an evening, much less a honeymoon.
No honeymoon, right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that was it. It wasn't about trust.
Yeah.
Completely. And not only that, like from the Buddhist tradition, where I have part of my background is, you go and you're free to leave anytime you want. We're not in a feudal system. The door is there. You can leave anytime you want. But if you want this lineage, you have to go through certain things until the teacher's satisfied. Not until I'm satisfied. I may think I'm satisfied with that, and you can go, but it's fine. But you don't. There's no transmission of lineage. It's until the teacher is satisfied, and that's something you do have to. Maybe trust. A better word is faith. You have faith that this is going to lead through. We have another hand up. Jonas, you want to open your mic, please? Jonas, where are you joining us from?
Hi, yes, I'm joining from London. I'm one of Fergal Sensei's students. So thank you everyone for for the very, very interesting conversation. We had a bit of a conversation in the chat on the side, kind of building a hypothesis, and I'd be really interested in hearing your points of views around this, which is essentially around the analytical kind of mental thing that we want to do in Western society, very, very clearly analytically pinpointing something in an academic way, whereas a lot of experiential craft is taught in a different way, as Frederick Sensei said earlier. So I'd be interested in just your points of views on this, if you may. Thank you.
Well, let's give Paul first shot if you'd like to.
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's different ways to play with this. I was an incessant question asker in Japan, and you know, my instructors would just do. They very rarely would explain, but I was supposed to feel it. And again, you know, we do have this kind of tendency to intellectualize the physical, which to me takes away from it. For my own students, if I get somebody who's very intellectually based and likes to really talk about it, and Toby and I share a student who's quite like this. He's a scientist, and he's really awesome in that if I wanted to ask him at any point, what technique did we do on Tuesday 3 years ago? He could look in his spreadsheet and he could tell me. But it's, you can use that to help them understand the physical, I think. You know, we don't necessarily want to over-intellectualize it. And this might be the point where Buddhism came in to kind of replace Shintoism in my sword group, is that, you know, we were talking about these very difficult concepts, and Buddhism was a way that everybody kind of understood and could maybe physically experience it. In the same way, you can take some of the intellectualism in the martial arts and use it to express the physical. So I kind of play those games with it. I like to use the intellectualism as just another way to experience the physical. But without the physical, I mean, there's no point in really trying it.
So about the balance between the intellect and practice.
In the 1800s, you had an influx of especially German-based education in Japan. And so one of the things that did is in the Koryu that were established or thriving during that period, you had a more science-based, intellectually based influence anyway. And so where you found the balance between experiential and this theoretical in physical movement and all that sorts of things, it was already there. It was already happening in Japan before the modern era. So what people like in Shindo Yoshinryu, we have to find that balance. And a lot of the schools that switched to that model realized they could teach faster and more efficiently if they took a more scientific approach and a less mystical approach. And so I think the question is, how do you find that balance? And I think all of the schools find that balance in their own way.
Beautiful, right? And George?
Well, you know, I always come from an Asian religions background academically. And, you know, in Buddhism, you have the concept of upaya, which is expedient means. And, you know, basically, 2,000 years of Buddhism is still about having some direct experience, you know, direct experience of reality, you might say, whatever, what we call enlightenment or whatever. That's the whole point of it. And yet you can't just jump into that. So their concept is that there's, you know, a fair amount of, I mean, there's hundreds of texts and thousands of pages written, all of which are supposed to just point the way to the experience. And you should be understanding that those words are not the reality. And so, you know, we're walking that. There's all sorts of things that we can say about our practices. And certainly in Aikido, I think that there's all sorts of the Shu-Ha-Ri, which is not inherent in the way I was taught, since I didn't talk about Shu-Ha-Ri all the time. And yet it's a very useful concept to structure your own, thinking about your own training. And certainly as a teacher, it's a very useful way to structure how you're looking at bringing people along. but you don't mistake that for having some inherent value on its own. I mean, that, you know, the Shu-Ha-Ri is really about getting to the point where the art is kind of in your DNA on a, you know, that your years and years of training has changed your default setting to the point where you don't have to think about it. And this is why so many high level teachers don't really even talk about it. You know, it's like, I could ask Saotome Sensei about principles, and he would look at me. I remember asking him specifically about a thing that some other teacher had been talking about. So I went up to him and I got all excited and I said, you know, Sensei, if you do this with your body, it does this. And he looked at me and he went, well, yeah, of course. And he walked off. And I don't think that he'd ever in his whole Aikido career thought about that as a separate issue until I mentioned it as a separate issue. And then when he thought about it, he said, well, yeah, you do that. For him, it was all integral. And, you know, for me, it was a helpful concept to tell me how to do something. But, you know, this is, a lot of this is, it's expedient. You use the intellectual part of it can help you direct your training, but you don't want to get lost in it because it's not the point. It's not what you're doing.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, since Ellis seems to have stepped away, I'll just make a quick comment on this one, Jonas. It's, you know, from the classic, I think all the classic disciplines, certainly Buddhism, since George mentioned that, there's a strong emphasis on deep experience in both practice and theory. And there's types of people. Some people, like I'm not an intellectual guy. I was never. I was out there playing with balls and sticks, and it was in the body, and I practiced it. I just love that. Other people are much more. You know, their kind of type is more the intellect. Wherever we fall in there, it doesn't matter. There has to be a balance, and I think for a full integration of what the art has to offer, or certainly a full integration of the utility of something like Shu-Ha-Ri, there should be a deep experience in both practice and theory. And there's a lot of meatheads in martial arts, and there's also a lot of over-intellectualization of martial arts. And those are neither good nor bad. They're just opposite poles. And, you know, we want to somehow, you know, in whatever way, have some type of integration. Paul Sensei, would you like to offer some final words?
Sure. I'd like to start with thanking you, Miles, for putting this all together. It's great fun. It's a great intellectual exercise. You know, this is the kind of stuff I wish we had time in the dojo to talk about, but usually we don't have that much time. This is what I call beer discussions. Right. You know, this is what we kind of talk about after we practice. But it's nice too to have such a large group of people who, you know, it's a preaching to the choir moment. You know, everybody here because they already do these kind of things and are experiencing them, and we do get to intellectualize it for a little while, and it's a great thing. I look forward to using these recordings of these to give to newcomers to say, here's one of the ways you might want to think about this, and those graphs you shared with me too. I think it's very interesting. It's for such a complex subject to try to put it into this into language or into drawings or everything. It's so complex. You know, we can intellectualize it and we must experience it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you, Paul Sensei. I appreciate it. Also, thanks to Toby Sensei, George Sensei, and Ellis Sensei for jumping in at the end. And thank you for all the participants who have joined us today. And may your practice lead you forward, forever and always forward on the path of Shu-Ha-Ri. Thank you, everybody.